I don't exactly remember when it struck me that this would be a good title for a presentation, that building good working relationships between IT and business it serves is a lot like building a good marriage, and I was trying to think about it before this presentation started. I've been in the business for over 25 years, and I've been married for over 25 years, so I could never figure out what the root of this was, but whether it was during a home or an office struggle, I don't recall when this hit me, but I'm sure it was probably due to some bump in one of those roads. And maybe you can relate, whether it's in the business or in the marriage. So it's kind of funny to reflect on the idea that this is a lot like a marriage for a minute. When you think about the talk track between couples and the talk track, at work, at the office, they're amazingly similar sometimes, and I know that's got to be what caused me to want to give this presentation. The advice you get, maybe some of you have been to a weekend marriage seminar or counseling or self-help books or whatever, but it made me realize that the advice that you get is surprisingly appropriate, although I'm not sure how easily implementable this is, because just like a marriage, most of the stuff we're going to be talking about today is pretty hard work. But have you ever heard things like, let's see here, if I can get my slide to show up here, this, perhaps at home or in the office? And the experts would certainly advise something like this, right? Or how about this one? It feels like you're not committed. Sounds amazingly familiar, right, to the thing that you hear at the office. And unfortunately, I think the advice that you would get is maybe, sadly, not as valued anymore in our high-speed world in the business world, but it's still, I think, important to think about the fact that it is a long-term commitment. If you think about it, you don't respect my opinions about anything. Boy, does that apply to either side of the situation here we're talking about. And I think a lot of problems in any partnership or any team effort, and I'm hoping that you will relate to this, and if you don't, I think you ought to reflect on it, comes down to, and I think there was a great song, right, R-E-S-P-E-C-T. It comes down to that, and that's something that I don't know that we talk about too much in the business world, but I think it's definitely something to reflect on. So we know, the other thing I think is that we know in this life we're going to have conflicts and we're going to have troubles, yet we often launch, into these relationships, whether they're at home or in the business, and these projects without really the tools to resolve conflicts. And, you start hearing the finger pointing and the fighting and the this and that, and I think that really comes down to the principle of having some good tools in your toolbox for conflict resolution, and that's some of the things that we're going to talk about today are really oriented towards trying to prevent conflicts or at least resolve them. And of course, one of the greatest pieces of advice, I think, is that you need to take the time to communicate, and certainly I would say that probably in most marriage books that is one of the key principles, and I think it applies here. So I've put some of the practices into this presentation that are really about how to improve communications, and of course that involves a two-way street, so we're talking about listening as well. But you have to wonder, what might happen if these principles were actually published, were considered ground rules, and were agreed to as part of the IT business process in organizations. And I have to think that the results would be better. And whether you're somebody sitting in the audience today that has the ability to implement some of the processes that we're talking about, or you can only handle this in a small context of who you're engaging with in the business, I think these principles anyway, are applicable to you wherever you're at. So I'll let you read this for a minute, if you can. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but the basic idea is that a lot of marriage and work issues you might think at the surface they point to poor people skills, and there are certainly some things that we can do to deal with that through training and through some of the things that we're going to talk about today, like clear role definition. But I think there are also some things that probably aren't really about people skills as much as they really are about setting people's expectations, getting clearer boundaries. We talked about the good communications and all the things that can improve, these relationships. But at the end of the day, it really is about people for sure. So what I wanted to talk about are 4 things. I mean, there's a myriad of things we could talk about, but I think that these 4 things can either really cause problems if they're absent, or they can certainly make a marriage or this relationship between IT and the business better if the organization chooses to work on these things. Some are a lot harder than others, but I wanted to talk about first front-end portfolio planning and just put it in the context of the bigger portfolio management that some organizations have and some don't, but I think it's important to talk about why that can help improve the relationship. And then, jump down to a very basic, doesn't matter how big you are, how small you are, how sophisticated, how mature you are, having clear project roles and accountabilities, I think is key to improving the relationship. Effective, and then just some couple best practices, really. Effective gate reviews, how can we make those better? How can we make those improve the communications? And then honest status reporting and, project performance analysis that's accurate and honest. So that's it. The first one, portfolio management, I'll just jump into. Now, I've presented webinars with CAI on portfolio management before and have been to some of the conferences and seminars talking about this. So there are some other references that go into a lot more detail. But you could almost look at this when you think about portfolio planning and portfolio management as really, the precursors, the prerequisites of things that should happen before you get married. Now, obviously, most of us aren't in the situation to start over with our IT and our business relationships. So sometimes this requires kind of laying a new foundation, blowing up the way things work and putting a new foundation in. And granted, that is very difficult when you've been working one way between IT and the business and you try to move to portfolio management. But like all things that are really difficult, if you can make this work, it's really worth it. So in the case of, trying to decide portfolio management is basically, in a nutshell, the assumption, I guess, is that most people sitting on the phone are in situations where the business has a lot more ideas, a lot more needs, a lot more desires for improving and for re-engineering and replacing their capabilities than the organization has investment dollars to spend. And so what you really need is a governance infrastructure and a defined process, and that's what, this is really all about. So the infrastructure we'll talk about a little bit more, and then we'll talk about some of the pieces of the defined process, both the portfolio management part and the project delivery part, and as we talk about these other 3 best practices. But I want to talk about the infrastructure first. But again, portfolio management is trying to basically help answer a couple of questions. The first is, and there's an assumption that, you've got a bucket of money, whatever the scope of that is, and the question is, which things should we invest in? And it really the question, I think, when you talk about having good portfolio planning is, a question that's looking